I've never told this story out loud, not really. Bits of it came out over the years, half jokes over whiskey, unfinished sentences when somebody asked why I left legal work so suddenly, but never the whole thing. Maybe because saying it plainly makes it real. Maybe because I spent years pretending it wasn't. The short version is this: I made a contract disappear. Not burned. Not shredded. Not stolen in the way people imagine. It simply became a document that, officially, had never existed. Back then I was 34, working as a junior contracts manager for a mid-sized construction firm. I wasn't some criminal mastermind. I was tired, underpaid, and angry in the quiet way that settles into your bones. My father had died the year before, leaving behind hospital bills and a mortgage I couldn't cover. My younger sister was calling every other week, trying not to sound desperate. Meanwhile, I spent my days watching men in expensive suits sign papers worth more than I'd make in 10 years. That's the part people always miss when they hear stories like this. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I'm going to commit a crime." It usually starts smaller. A humiliation. A panic. A feeling that the world has rules, but only for people like you. The contract belonged to a land acquisition deal. Nothing dramatic on the surface. Just parcels, numbers, signatures, deadlines. But buried inside it was a clause that would have cost one of our clients a fortune if it ever surfaced during arbitration. I found it by accident during a late-night audit. I still remember the fluorescent lights humming above me and the way my stomach dropped when I realized what I was looking at. At first, I did what honest people do. I told myself I'd report it in the morning. Then I didn't. Because that same night, one of the senior partners came back for a forgotten briefcase. He saw me at my desk. He looked at the open file. He didn't ask what I had found. He just stood there for a second and said, "Funny thing about paperwork, William. If nobody can prove it was ever there, it becomes very difficult to miss." Then he walked out. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes after he left. Not moving. Not breathing right. I knew exactly what he meant. And the worst part was, I knew he was right. That was the first moment I crossed the line. Not when I touched the contract. Not when I altered the record later. The line was crossed when I stayed in that chair and started thinking about how possible it would be. I told myself it was survival. I told myself I was already trapped. I told myself a lot of things that I didn't decide that night. That's the part that still bothers me. I went home, made coffee at 2 in the morning, and sat in my kitchen staring at the wall while rain tapped the window. If I'd acted on panic, maybe I could blame fear. Instead, I thought it through. That makes it colder. The next week I started watching how paper moved through the office. Every contract existed in 3 places: a physical archive downstairs, a scanned copy on the internal server, and an entry in the register. Nobody paid attention to the system because everyone trusted the system. That trust was the weak point. I stayed late every evening and built a routine that looked harmless. I volunteered for audit cleanup. I offered to reorganize old files. I even fixed the clerk's spreadsheet so people started seeing me as useful background furniture. I mapped out who left when, which cameras actually worked, and when the night cleaner took her smoke break. By Friday, I knew exactly how a document could vanish. The frightening part was how ordinary the plan looked. By the second week, I stopped thinking of it as a bad idea and started treating it like a project. That change in my head scared me more than the plan itself. Once you turn something wrong into a checklist, it becomes strangely manageable. I started with the register. Every contract was logged by date, department, and reference number. Deleting an entry outright would have been obvious, so I looked for something quieter. During an old audit, I noticed duplicate references caused by a software migration years earlier. Most people ignored them. I spent 2 evenings buried in archives until I found one close enough to mine that, with a small correction, it could swallow the contract without drawing attention. Then I practiced. Not the theft, the motions. Signing files out. Returning them. walking through the corridor without looking hurried, holding a folder under my arm like it belonged there. The strangest part was how normal everyone acted around me. People complained about deadlines, office coffee, football scores. Meanwhile, I was rehearsing how to erase evidence. The physical archive worried me more than the server. Computers leave trails, but paper has weight. Someone remembers carrying it, shelving it, touching the folder. If the original vanished carelessly, people would start asking practical questions, and practical questions are dangerous. The archive was in the basement behind a coded door that clicked loudly enough to echo down the corridor. Rows of gray cabinets, fluorescent lights that flickered, air that smelled like dust and toner. I spent 3 evenings down there, reorganizing. Mostly I was learning blind corners and habits. Martin from compliance always left at 6:40. The receptionist locked the front at 7. The cleaner came down at 7:25, mopped half the corridor, then stepped outside for a cigarette. I also found something useful, a cabinet with warped rails that jammed unless you lifted slightly before closing it. Tiny detail, but memorable. I decided that would matter later. By then I had stopped asking whether I should do it. My mind had moved on to timing. Once that happened, turning back started feeling harder than going forward. I chose a Thursday because Thursdays were noisy. People stayed late, which sounds risky, but noise hides movement better than silence. Around 7 the office settled into that familiar after-hours hum, printers in the distance, chairs rolling, phones finally quiet. I remember my hands feeling strangely steady. I signed out 3 folders from the archive, not one. That mattered. 1 missing file attracts attention. 3 looks like ordinary cleanup. The contract I wanted sat between 2 boring procurement agreements. I carried all of them upstairs, nodded at a junior analyst, and even stopped to complain about the air conditioning. I wanted the moment to feel forgettable. At my desk I scanned the room, then opened the folder. My mouth went dry when I saw the clause again. It was real. I wasn't imagining what it could cost people. The first step was the server copy. I had exactly 15 minutes before the automated backup started. That clock suddenly made every sound in the building feel much louder. The server was the part one thought would be clean. It wasn't. I opened the document directory, found the contract, and for a second just stared at the file name. My pulse was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I had already prepared the duplicate reference, and moved other records around so the folder structure looked untouched. All I needed was a small edit, then a transfer into the older archive branch where nobody checked closely. My hands betrayed me. The cursor slipped. I dragged the wrong file. For about 3 seconds I was certain I'd ruined everything. A procurement agreement disappeared from the active folder and landed in the wrong directory. I froze, then fixed it, but the panic left sweat running down my back. That was the first moment I understood how thin control really was. Then I heard footsteps outside my office. Not fast. Not suspicious. Just footsteps. I minimized everything and leaned back as if reading email. It was Carla from finance. She asked if I was still here. I smiled and said deadlines. She laughed, said, "Same," and kept walking. Only then did I breathe again. Once Carla disappeared down the corridor, I finished the server work faster than I should have. That was dangerous. Panic makes you rush, and rushing creates fingerprints. I moved the scanned contract into the older archive branch, renamed it under the duplicate reference, then adjusted the register entries so the dates matched the migration error I'd found. On paper, the contract no longer belonged to the current matter. It belonged to a dead administrative shadow. Then came the harder part, the original. I took the folder back downstairs. The basement felt colder than usual. Every sound seemed sharper, the scrape of my shoes, the buzz of the lights, the metallic clack of cabinet handles. I opened the drawer and slipped the contract out. That was when the cleaner came back early. I heard the bucket wheels before I saw her. My whole body locked. I shoved the folder half closed and turned, trying to look casual. She smiled and asked if I was still saving the company. I made some joke about paperwork breeding at night. She laughed. I didn't. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. When she rolled past, I stood there for a full minute pretending to read a label because my legs felt unreliable. The cleaner turned the corner, the bucket wheels faded, and the silence came back harder than before. I kept hearing my heartbeat in the cabinet doors. I forced myself to move. The contract was folded inside the folder, warmer from my hands. I slipped it under the stack I'd brought down earlier and closed the drawer, the warped one, the one that jammed unless lifted. It caught exactly the way I expected. I left it half stuck and muttered under my breath, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear irritation. If someone remembered me, I wanted them to remember a stubborn cabinet, not nerves. Back upstairs I returned 2 folders and kept one at my desk. Normal rhythm. Ordinary paperwork. The kind nobody notices. Then I made the contract itself disappear. Not destroyed. Hidden. There was a dead storage room behind records, barely used except for old stationery and broken monitors. I slid the document into an unmarked archive tube and tucked it behind a leaning metal shelf. Then I walked out. The next morning was worse than the night before. During the crime, everything narrowed into steps and timing. Morning brought people. People noticed things without meaning to. At 9:20 Martin from compliance stopped by my desk holding a folder. He frowned and asked whether I had moved anything in the basement. My stomach dropped so hard I thought he could hear it. I kept my face flat and said I had reorganized a few procurement files for audit prep. He nodded, but not fully. Then he mentioned the jammed cabinet. That nearly finished me. He said he'd found it half open and assumed the rails were getting worse. I shrugged, made a joke about the archive surviving longer than all of us, and he gave a short laugh. Then he walked away. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something uglier: confidence. By noon, people were talking about an upcoming arbitration review. That was when I understood the contract might be looked for sooner than I expected. I'd planned a disappearance. I hadn't planned urgency. Suddenly, every ordinary conversation sounded dangerous. That afternoon, the senior partner called me into his office. Same man who had made that comment about paperwork becoming difficult to miss. He didn't ask me to sit. He just stood by the window with the city behind him and said there was confusion in records connected to the land file. I remember feeling cold in my fingertips. He asked whether I had touched any archive materials during the audit. The question sounded casual, but it wasn't. I said yes: routine organization, duplicate references, cleanup. All true, which made the lie easier. He watched me for a second too long. Then he said, "Good. Keep your notes." That was it. But when I reached the door, he added something that stayed with me for years. People who panic create problems. People who stay calm usually don't. I walked out trying to look normal, but inside I was unraveling. I couldn't decide whether he suspected me, approved of me, or had quietly used me. Somehow that uncertainty felt worse than accusation. It made me feel less like a thief and more like a tool. For 3 days nothing happened. That almost broke me. Fear is easier when something is actually chasing you. What destroys you is waiting. Every email felt loaded. Every phone ringing on the floor made my shoulders tighten. I stopped sleeping properly. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning convinced someone had opened the storage room and found the tube. On Monday, the arbitration team started asking questions. Not dramatic questions. Administrative ones. Who handled the intake? Which version was uploaded? Why did the register show migration notes, but no active attachment? I answered carefully, staying inside facts, never volunteering more than necessary. That became my whole strategy: be useful, be boring, be forgettable. Then Carla mentioned something over coffee that hit harder than any formal inquiry. She said, "Funny, I could have sworn I saw that land file on your desk last week." My mouth went dry. I laughed and said she probably did. Half the office had touched it during audit prep. She accepted that. I didn't. I spent the rest of the day realizing memory, not evidence, could still destroy me. That week was when the adrenaline burned off and something heavier moved in. During the planning I felt sharp. During the act I felt electric. Afterward I felt contaminated. I started noticing ridiculous things. The click of my apartment lock sounded accusatory. When strangers looked at me on the tram, I wondered if they somehow knew. At work I kept hearing normal sentences as coded messages. "Can you come by my office?" would hit my chest like a siren before turning out to be a spreadsheet question. And guilt didn't arrive the way I expected. It wasn't moral thunder. It was smaller and meaner. My sister called one night asking if I was doing okay. I almost told her everything. Instead I lied and said work was just busy. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for nearly an hour. That was the moment I understood the real theft wasn't the document. It was the version of myself that used to speak without measuring every word first. Once that disappeared, I couldn't find it again. 2 weeks later the search stopped. Not officially. It just lost momentum the way office crises do when bigger ones arrive. A supplier dispute flared up, someone in senior management resigned, and suddenly the missing contract became an administrative irregularity instead of an emergency. That terrified me almost more than investigation. I had expected confrontation. What I got was absorption. Then I was called upstairs again. The senior partner closed the door and asked whether the archive confusion had been resolved. I said the migration records were messy, but there was no evidence the document had ever been formally entered into the active file. He held my eyes for a long second. Then he nodded. "Good," he said. "Then that's our position." That sentence changed everything. I walked out knowing I wasn't being accused. I was being folded into silence. No police. No disciplinary hearing. No dramatic exposure. I went to the storage room that night and moved the tube somewhere else. Not because anyone was close. Because suddenly I understood I had survived. And surviving felt much uglier than victory. I left the firm 6 months later. Officially it was for personal reasons. That was true, just incomplete. By then I couldn't walk through those corridors without feeling like the walls remembered more than people did. The strange thing is, nobody treated me differently. I still got invited for drinks. Carla hugged me goodbye. Martin joked that I was escaping before the archive collapsed and buried them all alive. I laughed with everyone else, and that nearly hurt the most. They were saying goodbye to the version of William they thought they knew. I kept the contract. Not because I planned to use it. Not for leverage. I think I kept it because throwing it away would have made the whole thing feel cleaner than it was. It stayed in a sealed envelope in the back of a wardrobe for years. Every time I moved apartments, I carried it myself. That became the punishment. Not fear of getting caught. Not even guilt exactly. Just living with the quiet knowledge that one ordinary night I learned how easy it was to become someone I didn't recognize. I'm older now, and distance has made the story less dramatic but more honest. People hear crime and imagine greed, malice, some grand appetite for risk. Mine was smaller than that. It started with pressure, resentment, and one moment where I realized I could move a single piece of paper and change the shape of other people's lives. That's what I learned. The dangerous part isn't desperation. It's rationalization. The second you start explaining to yourself why your situation is special, why the rules bend just this once, you're already halfway there. I was never caught. Not officially. But getting away with something doesn't mean escaping it. Some acts don't follow you in headlines or courtrooms. They settle somewhere quieter. In habits. In caution. In the way you pause before answering simple questions. So if you ever find yourself standing at that edge, tired, angry, convinced nobody will notice, walk away before planning starts. Because once you learn how easy it is, that knowledge never really leaves.